Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the globe. Joining us today is Nick Tuffley, Chief Economist for ASB and Executive Chairman of KPMG in New Zealand, Ross Buckley. Gentlemen, great to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
Genevieve. Great, and let's start with the New Zealand dollar. How are we doing, Nick?
Well, it's from a farmer's point of view, perhaps not so great. It has been relatively firm, and one of the reasons why it's been holding up is we've had this period of tranquility where since the European Central Bank said they would do whatever is necessary to preserve the euro, there's generally been that sense that they're actually going to do some action, and that has really calmed volatility in markets down a lot.
Can we talk a little bit about the ASB commodity prices now, your latest index out? What's that telling us?
Well, what we've seen since about mid-May, early June is that generally commodity prices have stabilised, and in some cases we've seen some tiny increases coming back through. So I think that's a bit of good news after those pretty sharp falls that we saw, particularly in dairy and meat prices from about the end of last year through to about May. So a better, more stable environment, I think.
Yeah, and certainly for dairy, which drives this country, Ross, global dairy trade auctions tell us that for the second time in a row, prices are moving up. What are you picking for dairy?
That's right. I think the last two auctions give us quite positive indications of where that index is going. I guess the big news, which will have quite a significant impact, is the US drought. It's probably the worst drought they've had in 50, 60 years. There's going to be a big demand for food, and that's going to benefit New Zealand in the short to medium term.
Fonterra looks like it's on track now for its $5.50 payout. Is that what you believe as well?
That's right, and I think that statistic we've just seen about their exports for the last 3 months of this season, the months of May, June, July, 36% over the same period last year.
Yeah, 620,000 tonnes. Imagine that.
That's right, and a lot of that's going into the Middle East and Asia. They even had to charter a vessel in order to deliver it. So quite positive signals going into the new season.
And total milk production now up 10%. That's phenomenal, isn't it, Nick?
It is, and I think it really shows that great burst of weather that we had. But looking ahead, it also sounds like we've had a reasonable start to the season so far as well. So there's always that possibility that we actually increase production slightly over last year's strong production.
And you mentioned previously a slight lift in meat prices. Tell me more.
Well, we have seen after those sharp falls more recently that our beef and our lamb prices and our index in New Zealand dollar terms have been creeping up off their lows. So that's good news. I think when we look ahead with the drought, the implications for meat prices, particularly beef prices, are a little bit different to dairy, where in the short term what we're now starting to see is a lot of culling of herds in the US. So there's always that chance in the short term we see a bit of a downward push on global beef prices. But I think when we're heading into next year, the prospects look really good because there'll be all that herds, the flocks lacking over in the US, and that's going to mean, whilst they're rebuilding their herds, that we have a bit of a shortage of beef around, and that should help drive up prices next year.
And looking at the grain situation globally, how long is it going to take to get things back on track around the world, do you think, with the current US drought?
Well, the US drought will have international ramifications, and I think already we've seen the futures prices escalate on wheat, soybean and corn. So it is going to be a while. So I guess we're dependent on water, and they obviously need to address their drought conditions. So it could be another 12, 18 months before we see some return to normality. Yeah,
wool prices here in New Zealand, of course, not great still. Got any intelligence on that, Ross?
Well, again, I hear they're looking at the sector strategy for the wool sector. What do they do about it? That's been looked at many times. We as New Zealanders know the product and know a lot of the positive attributes about it. So I think they've just got to keep working away on how we can maximise those returns.
And I see today that Fletcher building results are going to be out, and they're predicting that they're going to be lower than they were a year ago. Still no move forward on the rebuild in Christchurch. Not good news.
Well, that's one thing that seems to be holding it back a little bit, but also one thing we've also got to remember is that nearly half of the profits come out of Australia, and things have been very quiet there. The market there was slowing, particularly the housing market slowing for quite some period, though that looks to be stabilising over there at the moment with the recent interest rate cuts that we've seen in Australia. But yes, it's still fairly challenging. One positive thing though is we are seeing some really sharp lifts in building consent issuance for houses, particularly in Christchurch and also to a degree in Auckland. So I think we are going to see the construction really start to ramp up towards the end of the year.
Although what worries me is that according to The Economist, they ranked more than 20 countries around the world. We're among the most overvalued when it comes to housing in the world. Does this worry you, or is your mortgage paid for?
There are concerns there, and housing affordability is a big issue, but the demand seems to be there, especially in centres such as Auckland. I think the other big statistic is the cost to build a new house in New Zealand is very expensive compared to the international scene.
How come?
I think it's critical mass and scale. So you'll see in Europe and the US with their scale, they can build a lot more cheaper than we can here in New Zealand.
Yeah, so it just comes down to population. We pay to live in an island paradise, don't we?
That's right, and we pay to live fairly central to some of the city centres as well.
When we look at the economy as it exists today, snapshot, what keeps you awake at night? What do you worry about?
Well, I believe the European position and the North American position is going to be there for nearly a decade, so that does have long-term ramifications. I think we're saved a little bit by the Asia-Pacific region that we're part of, so that's a challenge. I think the other statistic I saw recently is the unemployment rates for some of our younger people is higher than I thought it would be. It's about 17%, I think, for the age group of 17 to 24, and I think that's concerning. So we're very good at educating people. What are we doing about retaining them here in New Zealand? And
the agribusiness sector is struggling to get young people to come in, and yet we all know it drives the economy. How do we marry those two up and have a brighter future for everyone in this country? Nick?
Well, part of it does come down to, I think, it's people being given that option or being shown that option, and perhaps that's one part of it is that young people need to be made more aware of the options that they do have. Ironically, we actually have quite high unemployment coming through in some of the regional areas where they're obviously a lot more closer to areas where, in theory, we should have those opportunities for jobs.
I'm curious, if you were young guys starting out all over again, where would you be thinking about heading? What kind of job would you be doing?
I've obviously done business, and I still see business as being a positive opportunity. My key message would be making sure you get as much international experience as possible.
Okay, what about you, Nick?
Ticked through the Formula One driver, the Top Gun fighter pilot, and sort of realised I didn't quite have those skills. But I think the key thing for people is one, getting a sense of what they are good at, but I think really importantly, getting a sense of what you enjoy doing and trying to marry those two up, because ultimately I think whatever people do, that you have to enjoy it or else you're not going to do it for long. And I think for young people, they need to look and think really hard, what really spins my wheels, and outside of racing around in the car, and what really is the thing that makes them passionate, and work through on that, because it's that having that passion, I think, that is really what makes you put the energy in and learn and dedicates you to whatever you do.
Okay, thanks guys. We'll be back after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. We're with Nick Tuffley and Ross Buckley. And Ross, let's go to Europe now. You've just been there for 3 weeks. How come? And what are your perceptions about what's going on?
Well, my wife is Dutch, so we went back to catch up with her family, and it'd be fair to say it's a great time to travel. As Nick said, the currency's strong, so you've got really good buying power. But it'd be fair to say, on the countries we visited, they are really hurting. Their stock indices are well down. Even though the interest rates can be quite low, the banks aren't advancing money. So it is hurting, and as you get to further south in Europe, you start to see levels of unemployment, and so it's quite common. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to be an issue they're going to have to face for at least a decade. What
did you notice particularly about Holland? What are the little things you noticed as you went about life there? What are people saying to you?
That's right. When I spoke to the business people, they said by just walking around the streets and dealing with people, you don't really notice it. But when you actually get into understanding some of the key metrics around stock market indices, and that it is a very challenging marketplace. They're really looking to people to make sure they have got security of income before they get advanced funds. So it is a very challenging marketplace. And the Dutch economy really is on the coattails of a very strong German economy, which again I think is starting to be dragged down into the Eurozone.
So that's a little concerning, because when the powerhouses of Europe begin to falter and aren't as confident, doesn't that send a chilling effect out to the rest of the globe, Nick?
Well, it does demonstrate that Germany may not be able to pull the rest of Europe along. And in the second quarter, Germany did manage to grow fractionally, but there's the signs of a bit of slowing momentum, and with Germany, like a good 40% or so of its exports do go to the rest of the European Union as well. So it will get hurt if there's that drop in domestic demand in the rest of Europe. And the challenge they've got is that monetary policy could perhaps do more, but interest rates are already low, but you do have a lot of that fiscal tightening come through, and just that uncertainty. And I mean, in some of those southern European countries where no one really has that full confidence that they will remain in the euro, so you actually have money being hoarded or sent out of the country, so you're actually having these challenges with actually holding on to the capital that you need to run an economy and help get businesses and households chugging along.
Yeah, interesting. You were also in France. France is, of course, in dire straits. What are your perceptions of what you saw there, Ross?
That's right. We were probably quite lucky. We're in the south of France, so there it's obviously a big tourist sector.
La-di-da.
La-di-da,
Yeah,
yes,
did you
it was
see
very
any
good.
Hollywood stars
No.
or, big yachts?
Yeah, we saw lots of big yachts.
I bet you did.
We didn't go on them at all. But no, so you didn't really see the impact there so much. But I think when you come to rural and manufacturing within France, I think that they are hurting.
The issue for Germany is that the existence of one of the bailout funds, the European Stability Mechanism, is going through the courts in Germany just to see if it is constitutional, in line with Germany's constitution. If it is, then it will be formed and things will be a bit smoother. It could be a bit of a hiccup if the courts rule that it is not actually in line with the German constitution, because that's quite a bit of a setback. That is one of the two funds that is expected to be helping over time keep Spain and Italy's borrowing costs from getting too high. So it's quite an important hurdle. And again, we come back to the Germans often being a bit of a handbrake, whether it's not the politicians or their legal system. And I mean, quite rightly, they have some issues over how much of the, power over Germany gets divested to the sort of wider European organisations.
So in light of all this, what's the best thing that we Kiwis, working class Kiwis, farmers, whoever, can do to protect ourselves in these very uncertain times?
Well, I think it's all around financial literacy, and I think it's people dealing with dumb debt.
Now, interesting you should say financial literacy, because one of the stories that has emerged is how some banks, sorry about this, Nick, how some banks apparently were doing something called swaps, and it's really affected some farmers. Explain to me simply how it works.
So there is accusations that a number of the banks might have pushed products onto farmers, trying to demonstrate to them how they could limit any upside risk in interest rates. What the accusations sort of say is that perhaps the farmers didn't understand what they were buying, and hence I think it's probably an opportunity for them to take some independent financial advice. So I think it comes back to the topic of financial literacy, and people should understand what products they might be buying or signing up for.
Is it kind of buyer beware? Is it any different from going to the bank and getting out a mortgage, for example? Is it the farmer's fault because they didn't understand what would happen? Or is it the bank's fault for not telling them enough detail, allegedly?
Well, I'm not really close enough to it to know exactly what has gone in behind whichever the problems have been raised. I think the thing with a lot of financial market products like forward exchange rates, swap agreements, they are tools that can be used to reduce risk or increase the certainty that a business has. But they can work in two ways. I mean, if you're using one of those instruments that locks in essentially a degree of certainty, and things can either go your way and you get a clear benefit out of that. If they go the other way, you certainly had some certainty over what your costs were going to be. But of course, there's that situation where if you hadn't entered into that, you could have had a better outcome. The challenge is, before you entered into it, you wouldn't have really known what the outcome would have been. So there can be those issues where if you're after certainty, what you do give away is that flexibility to benefit if things do go your way, but it reduces your downside if things certainly don't go your way. So those are the things that people do have to weigh up, and I guess the points made before, making sure that you understand them and feel you've got the right advice. So you're making informed decisions. I mean, those tools are there to try and help people get better outcomes or better sleep at night.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to that question, Ross. I'm sorry I interrupted you about the swaps thing, but what can farmers do to protect themselves now? What's your best advice?
Well, I think when there is a range of financial products that farmers can use, but I think the key thing is, just picking up on that point, is when you look at the scenarios, I think they need to stress test it or do the what-if scenarios. So how will this product work?
Best case scenario?
Well, how will this case work if the interest rates went up?
Yeah.
What happens if the interest rates go down? What happens if the currency goes up? What happens if the currency goes down? And do those scenarios around it so you're fully informed of the financial consequences. Then you'll make a better risk-weighted decision.
Now, speaking of decisions, since last we met here on the set, the Crayford Farms has gone through. It's been sold to the Chinese, Shanghai Penjin. What's your take on it? What do you think the rest of the world's thinking about us now and how we do business?
Well, that's right. It's been quite a drawn-out saga, hasn't it, really? But I think the outcome where we've got to, we're subject to, I think, final approval by the Overseas Investment Office, is good news for New Zealand. I think we've seen Shanghai Penjin come in with the best offer. They've had to meet quite a few hurdles. The Overseas Investment Office hurdles are very, very demanding. They include things such as making sure they've got the right financial commitment, they've got the commercial experience, the relevant experience, they're of good character. Plus, on top of that, they have to demonstrate and identify what other benefits they will contribute to the New Zealand economy. So whether that's increased productivity, environmental issues, public access to the land, improvement or investment in production and so on. So they've got to meet all that, and if they don't meet those criteria and deliver on those, the whole decision could be unwound. So overall, I think a good decision for New Zealand. It does show that we're open for business and would encourage other investors to come here.
I suppose for us the good news is that Landcorp, the state's biggest farmer, is going to be heavily involved in this, Nick.
Well, that does mean that there is a high degree of confidence being brought to the management of those farms. I think it's a very positive thing. I think we also have to look at, the big picture is that for New Zealand and many other countries, China is going to be hugely influential on our future prospects, and for dairy as well, and increasingly for meat and wool, we're going to see those same things. So companies that help get us a bit of a footprint in China also add a lot of value to the table as well.
So are you picking that we'll see more Chinese buying up land here in New Zealand?
Well, who knows? I think the story for New Zealand is that for well over 100 years we've always had a degree of foreign capital coming in here because we don't create enough of our own. I think what we will see over time is that certainly trade flows between New Zealand and China will continue to increase, and with the rest of wider Asia as well. That's simply where the growth in the world and the opportunities are, and we have to figure out as a nation how we best take advantage of that.
Thanks, Nick. Coming up after the break, future-proof on the highways and byways of the economic world, as our experts point out what's coming up. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks, and now it's time for Future Proof. What's on the radar of our guests? Can we start with you, Ross? What are you going to be keeping your eye on over the next week or so?
Well, we're right in the middle of the 30 June reporting season, so a lot of our publicly listed companies are reporting their full year results. So that is a very good time to actually hear the briefings, hear the explanations, and it'll give us a good indication of what the current performance is like and what the future outlook is for each company. So should be a good sort of warning signals and highlights for what's ahead.
Who's been doing really well so far? Any surprises?
Well, Nick referred to earlier the building sector. That's obviously been challenging. There have been delays in Christchurch. I think the energy sector, and linked with some of the privatisation of the SOEs, some of those results are quite mixed. I think Meridian result was down on forecast. Solid Energy looks lower as well.
Yeah, and in fact, the Prime Minister is now saying that Solid Energy will probably not be up for sale for quite a while because they got to come to terms with what's going on inside that business.
That's right, that's right. And also we're going to see for the first time the separate reported results for Telecom and Chorus, now that they've been through the demerger. So that'll be of interest, I think, to the public.
What are you going to be watching for? What do you think's going to happen?
Well, I think they are New Zealand, very prominent New Zealand companies. I think there'll be a lot of New Zealand investors holding shares in them, and I think they'll be wanting to get a stable return from both those investments. And as people are looking to see where they invest their money, they'll be looking for core investments such as those.
Nick, what about you? What are you going to be keeping your eye on for the next 7 days?
Well, one thing we are keeping close eye on is what's happening in the US with the drought. We have US dairy expert at one of the universities there who provides weekly commentary for our commodity report, and he just reported through that so far up until the end of June, milk production in the US hasn't really been affected by the drought. It's obviously looking back a little bit, but that'll be one thing to keep an eye on. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the actual impact the drought will have. It's too late for anything to happen to improve the corn situation, but what people don't quite know is just how bad the corn production has been hit. But no amount of rain now will save the corn.
The Americans export 40% of the world's corn, correct?
It's a phenomenal
It is
rate,
phenomenal.
yes.
How are the grain markets doing in the rest of the globe?
Well, I think there'll tend to be some knock-on effects. We've certainly seen soybeans being affected as well, which is another crop which has had some degree of effect, not as bad as corn coming through. I think the challenge is as we go forward and these supply constraints become more apparent out of the US is that we may well see those knock-on effects. Hopefully not like what we saw back a few years ago where we saw just such a broad-based increase in things like wheat, rice, export restrictions coming on, which compounds the price impacts in other countries as well. So I think it's a watch and wait at this stage, but we've certainly seen some very sharp increases in the sort of prices traded in the US for things.
And
one product that impacts New Zealand already is palm kernel.
Okay,
where
tell me
A lot
more.
of New Zealand farmers, especially dairy farmers, import that product. It's a high protein product, good for feeding cows, producing milk. Already those prices have escalated as a result of that. So that'll be a higher cost input for the New Zealand dairy farmers already this season.
Yeah, so what's the best way for dairy farmers to insulate themselves in the coming months?
Well, I guess it's looking at the diverse range of food supply they have got. The season at the moment with the rainfall on that I think is looking reasonable for them, but the cost of any imported product now I think is going to be so much higher.
Although certainly in terms of the U.S. corn drought, Americans use so much now to make ethanol. They're not even using it to feed the planet. Do you think that's got to change?
That's right, it's used for ethanol, biofuels and a few byproducts as well. So I think that just highlights the demand we have now on a very scarce product. It's just going to push those prices up.
We do have more words coming out of the Federal Reserve later on this week.
Exactly. Yes. Now isn't Mr. Bernanke is going to be speaking at his famous Jackson Hole, Wyoming get-together. And this is where all the big brains from around the world come to hear what he has to say. What do you think the message will be?
Well, everybody is really focusing on the Fed with the big question of do we see what's known as QE3 or not? So the third round of quantitative easing, and that has been a fixation of markets over the last couple of months. So when Ben Bernanke gets up and talks to everybody, there'll be a lot of focus to see whether or not he's giving any strong hints of the next way forward for the Federal Reserve. The irony is in the US, even as we've seen a lot more focus or speculation about this quantitative easing, is that some of the economic data has been looking a little bit better. Yeah. Employment's not quite so drab as what it was a few months ago, and the US housing market is actually starting to recover very gradually from a very, very low base. So there are some encouraging signs there, but it's in an economy where it will probably struggle to grow somewhere around about 2% this year.
But it is unlikely, I think, with all of these more positive indicators, if you can call them that, it is unlikely that they will print more money, correct?
That's right, and I think those early indicators are still very early signs, actually. I think it's still quite a long way to go.
Why do you think that? What worries you about the US of A?
Oh, I just think they're in such a deep trough at the moment. I don't think they really are implementing enough austerity measures across the wider population. I think there's still a lot of oversupply of some of the housing product. And I think they've just got to knuckle down and trade their way out of it, and it's going to take a while. Yeah,
it's going to take quite a while, and it's going to take a while for us, too, to come to grips. You're picking 10 years. Bill English, the finance minister, is picking at least 10 years before the global situation improves. How do we stay positive? What's your philosophy? Go on.
Well, I do think the issue, well, certainly with Europe, is 10 or 20 years for some countries to get their debts down from very high levels. There's also a lot of structural shift. I mean, the reality is that in Europe, also in the US, and we've even seen it here at times, you cannot keep on propping up economies with governments borrowing money from future generations to do it. At some point that ends. And so there will be a lot of, I think, economic restructuring that will be taking place over a period of times. And the actual process of reducing debts, unless you go and just promise not to repay them, which is quite a messy way of solving your debt problems, it will take quite a while to get them down. So we are going to have, I think, a long period where Europe is growing very weakly and it is struggling to even grow at the moment. The thing I think we have to look at is, again, back to Asia, because the dynamics there are very different. It doesn't have all these big issues of governments that have spent beyond their means for decades and now reaping the worst of that. So that's the area I think New Zealand needs to look at, because talk about being positive, there are lots of positives that we could find in that region, and that's where we need to look.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks to my guests, Ross Buckley and Nick Tuffley. Be sure to check out our website at country99tv.co.nz for the latest updates on rural developments here at home and abroad. Keep the faith. See you next time.